Hello and welcome, folks. Today's first pass video is on CBS Knowledge Standard 4, Understanding the Principles of Classical and Operant Conditioning. So just by way of background, when I talk to folks that are less familiar with behavioral psychology, there are some misunderstandings that come up. I would say the most prominent one is just equating behaviorism with like methodological behaviorism of Watson, where we're only focused on overt behavior. So they're not familiar necessarily with how Skinner operationalized and brought in private events starting in 1945 and ongoing. So that's probably the biggest misunderstanding about behaviorism that I see. But the other one that I see sometimes less prominently is a criticism about behaviorism. I'm not appreciating clients' history. There's kind of this idea that it's just kind of working in the here and now and with things that we only have in the present environment. Which is kind of a big misunderstanding because actually behaviorism has a really deep appreciation for the importance of history in the work. It's just that there's a specific way of talking about it that is consistent with sort of the aims of behaviorism and functional contextualism, right? So because we want to have that prediction and influence, we are going to talk in kind of special ways about history, but we are interested in the context that is defined both historically and situationally. I think a nice way to think about this comes from a metaphor from Emily Sandow's, actually talking about interbehaviorism, which is one influence on CBS approaches. But she has this beautiful paper where she gives the metaphor of clinical work being like a potter working with clay on the wheel. And with clay, we can think about it has a intensely long history, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. You think about sort of the dirt and the ground and the water all coming together to form the raw materials that then get turned into clay and then get thrown on the wheel to be turned into specific types of items. Like when when the potter is interacting with the clay, feeling the brittleness and the softness and the response of the clay, to their movements, um, that is due to the history. They are encountering the history in that moment, and so we only have the here and now to work with, but the history comes into that interaction. And so clinically, it's kind of the same thing. We may not be able to see or have been present for our client's past history, but we see the impact of it in the here and now as we have the clinical interaction unfolding and as we work towards building kind of a future a state that client desires. So I think that metaphor is really helpful to remind us about how history plays out in a behavioral context. And the other thing that's nice about that metaphor is it really emphasizes the process, right? This idea of moving from one state to another in a stepwise way. That is what we mean by a process. And that is sort of what is meant by this new move towards process-based therapy or process-based CBT. So this process-based CBT book came out some years ago, and it was informed by a work group that basically asked the question, what do CBT therapists need to do? What are the core competencies of that? Many of the competencies here you'll see will be characteristic of those third wave approaches like ACT. So we have cognitive diffusion. We have second wave approaches like modifying core beliefs, cognitive reappraisal, and exposure. But then there's these first four that may be less familiar. These are things that we don't tend to talk about too much in grad programs, even if we're talking about CBT. So contingency management, stimulus control, shaping, and self-management. And really those pieces are coming out of more of the understanding from classical conditioning and operant conditioning, those early kind of first wave and second wave approaches to learning. And then later, when we get to RFT, we're going to add in that verbal piece, which is then going to allow us to have this full range and think about how all of these processes play together. But today we're going to put some attention on some of these, on the theories that inform these first four competencies. And so it's helpful here. We're going to talk about contingencies, which is a fancy name really just for an if then condition. So just noticing that if then one thing happens and another thing happens, those are contingencies. And there's two kinds that we're really going to pay attention to. Direct contingencies are those where the behavior and the consequences are directly linked in the environment. So you do a thing and then something happens directly. That's a direct contingency. And then indirect contingencies are where the behavior and consequences are not directly linked through the environment. They may be linked through in a socially mediated way. In other words, they're delivered by a person, not the environment. So, like a parent, praising us, shaping our behavior through us kind of following their rules. Um, we see indirect contingencies a lot. We're going to talk about this more later when we get to rule governed behavior, relational frame theory and values. So indirect contingencies are a lot of what we work with when we're talking to pretty verbally sophisticated adults or children in therapy. But direct contingencies are applicable to everybody. We all still are influenced by direct contingencies. And so we do need to have an appreciation of this in addition to understanding kind of those contingencies that are set up more through verbal behavior. So today we're just focusing on direct contingency learning, and there's a few kinds. There's habituation, which is a billion-year-old process at least, which is basically where you just see decreased responding in response to repeated stimulus presentation. So you see this a lot in animal presentations where you repeatedly produce a stimulus and they have an initial reaction, and that reaction over time is decreased, and that's showing habituation. And then sensitization is kind of the opposite of that. That's when you have a stimulus through the presentation where the response increases as a function of the presentations of the stimulus. So those aren't focused on terribly much in clinical work. You might have the example of kind of habituation, just to think about that, of like when you first put on a piece of clothing, you really notice all of the sensations over the day. That piece of clothing kind of may pass over the same sense of your skin, and you may not have such a strong response to it. um, but we don't see this as much in human work because we have a lot that's mediated through operant um, conditioning and then later verbal conditioning through RFT. So habituation and sensitization are in there, but then the main ones where we look at direct contingency learning for human um, organisms would be classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And those appear to be about 500 million years old. So there's evidence that species were responding through classical and operant conditioning at least half a billion years ago. And they really are kind of thought to be sort of the same learning process, so they're not quite as separate as they are sometimes talked about. But for the sake of understanding, it can be useful to kind of break them out and look at them separately. So we'll do that a little bit here. All right. So if we start with classical, which is also sometimes called respondent or Pavlovian conditioning, we can distinguish that from operant conditioning. And I'm borrowing a lot of this from the Handbook of Applied Behavior Analysis. So I'm going very quickly. Apologies to any behavior analysts, but this is a good reference if you want to see this presented in more technical detail. But what we see here are kind of the two different ways that we divide up the events when we're looking at this. So at the top, we're looking at the stream of environmental events. So that just means like the stimuli that are happening in the environment. And so when we talk about classical conditioning, we're really looking at that kind of stream. So in this case, we're going to focus on the environmental stimuli. So there's going to be environmental stimulus that is going to serve uh, to elicit a response. So we're dividing up the world kind of based on the stimuli that are there. In contrast, operant conditioning, which started with Thorndike and then is associated now with Skinner, instead of looking at the stream of stimuli, we're going to look at the stream of behavioral events. So we're going to look at those behavioral actions that happen, and some of those behavioral actions are going to elicit responses. So when we talk about classical conditioning, we talk about this format where we are looking at the environmental stimuli and then the consequences that happen as a result of them. So some of the key terms that we're talking about here, unconditioned stimulus or stimuli. So these are stimuli that have properties without training history. So for example, like food, when you put food in your mouth and you salivate, um, that happens without necessarily any trained history with the food. Food, it just naturally does that for certain organisms, including us. Conditioned stimulus, those are stimuli that do not have that property naturally, but might come to acquire it through a particular kind of training history. Unconditioned responses, those would be like the salivation in response to putting food in your mouth. So the response happens without a training history. And then the conditioned response, those are the responses that are occurring due to the training history. So they actually tend to be the same as unconditioned responses like swallowing or blinking, but they're what we call them conditioned responses when they're happening based on their training history and not because of their untrained history. Another key distinction that we need to appreciate here is that for organisms, things that are repetitive, in other words, things that we tend to work for that tend to lead to approach behavior, they tend to just work differently than things that are aversive. So the things that we tend to work to avoid or that tend to lead to escape behavior. So appetitive versus aversive, there's a lot of technical stuff you can unpack related to that, but it is a key piece to understand because it does seem to work differently. So keep that distinction in mind, appetitive versus aversive. So if we use an example of the classical conditioning, folks may be kind of familiar with this. This would be a typical kind of lab experiment where we've got a rabbit who has it's called a nictitating membrane, and when you shock it or if you shine a light on it, there's a habitual response to blink the membrane to kind of clear the eye. So that is the unconditioned response, blinking, and there are unconditioned stimuli that evoke that response. So they can be a puff of air or they can be a shock um, uh, to the eye. You'll see this nictitating membrane response. So in the classical conditioning example, you take a stimulus that you want to condition. Let's say here it's an audio tone. So the audio tone doesn't by itself elicit the blinking response. But if you have several trials where you have the tone going and then you have the unconditioned stimulus, the shock added, you will get the blink, right? And over time, that conditioned stimulus, the tone, may come to control the response of blinking even without the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, the shock. Now, there are some variations in the timing of the conditioned stimulus relative to the unconditioned stimulus. Different pairings can work, but the most common one that we see is where the conditioned stimulus occurs before, just slightly before, the unconditioned stimulus. So the timing is pretty sensitive. We usually want it to happen very quickly together. There's kind of an exception with food aversion, so there can be a long delay uh, in the in the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus with food aversions. But typically, you want these to be very quickly coinciding in time. Also, what we want to see for this to be successful is that the unconditioned stimulus really has an impact, that it changes what's happening currently. So if a behavior's if a response is already happening and then we add another unconditioned stimulus, it's going to be hard to get pairing, right? So if you're already kind of salivating and then you try to do the tone food pairing, um, you're, it may not work because you're already salivating. But what you want is something where the salivation is not occurring, conditioned stimulus comes on, unconditioned stimulus comes on as well, turns on the salivation, and that change is noticeable, what we call a behavioral discrepancy, and it leads to successful classical conditioning. Okay, So just to kind of put this quickly in perspective, with classical conditioning, we distinguish between the acquisition, developing the classical conditioning response, maintenance, how it's maintained, and then extinction. And so you can see here we got three groups of animals getting several hundred trials at a time of these pairings of, let's say, the tone and the shock. And you'll see that all of them, even if they receive that only 25% of the time, 50% of the time, or 100% of the time, do acquire the classical conditioning response after several hundred trials. And you notice that once it's acquired in the maintenance phase, that this response continues to show. So even if they're only getting shocked one quarter of the time, that response continues to stay high once it's been acquired. In the extinction condition on the right, what we see is we're no longer going to have this pairing. So we're going to present the tone, but we're not going to ever present the shock in that case. And so basically, tone no longer predicts shock. And we see what happens. And you see it's a little bit different for the three different groups because of the rate at which they had been experiencing a shock, but all of them over time show this decrease, and so you get less of the response. So the tone no longer comes to reliably predict the membrane response. So this is sort of the typical pattern that you would see with classical conditioning. Another feature we might see is stimulus generalization. This is when we see responses happening based on a physical similarity between the stimuli. So, good example would be like if we had a green light that is our conditioned stimulus. So, we've established that the green light really predicts a conditioned response. We would expect to see that a little bit as we move slightly away from that specific tone of green to slightly lighter or darker green, um, maybe less of a strong response. And then eventually, as we move quite a ways away from green into a totally new color, there's no longer similarity between the physical stimulus, and so that light would no longer evoke the conditioned response. So you see this kind of gradient of stimulus generalization based on the properties of the stimulus. So clinical implications of this kind of work. Mostly in the clinic, we're going to be working based on operant principles, not classical conditioning. But this does allow us to think about how some kind of responses might have been established in the past. So we can appeal to specific learning histories as we look for respondent conditioning. In general, I think this work also helps remind us that when we're working in the clinic, if there are relevant stimuli that really do participate in controlling behaviors of interest, we should try to include those stimuli. So, as an example, for those of us who do parent training work, we might have a kid who responds to us. We can give commands and they respond to us and follow them through. But when a parent gives those same commands, we see different kind of response. We see more, tantruming or non-compliance. And so that's why we want to bring the parent into the clinical environment, because the parent is a relevant stimulus for that target behavior. And so we want to include the stimuli where we can that are relevant. And then sometimes we can't always do that. We can't totally work in the natural environment. We might get change in the clinic that doesn't kind of match what happens in the natural environment. And so then we might go the other way. We might recognize that we have stimuli in the clinic that are not in the natural environment, and we want to bring them back into the natural environment to support behavioral generalization. So different kinds of reminder stimuli or particular ways of talking, we might want to bring those back into the natural environment and see if they can control the behavior there, and so that it's not just limited to the clinic. And in general, this starts to remind us, both for classical and operant conditioning, that if there are these contingencies in the natural environment that are maintaining unwanted or dysfunctional behavior, we're going to need to do something about that. We're going to need to supplement them, or we're going to need to replace them with alternate contingencies that allow us to get the behavior that is desired in the clinical environment also happening in the natural environment. And so, just a couple of nice quotes that I think help remind us of this is that, um, we can't inoculate against what's there in the natural environment. So we've got to be aware of that. We've either got to change the natural environment so that the pairing of stimuli and response doesn't happen, or we've got to establish new behavior and have new, potent consequences that are going to outcompete or minimize contact with the reinforcers that we're maintaining unwanted behavior. So we can't really inoculate against that, and also folks can't unlearn. There's this expression in ACT that there's no delete button in the nervous system, and we see this in classical and operant conditioning that yes, we can change contingencies and we can get behavior to decrease its rate, but it can naturally resurge. So if you put those conditions back in place and you have that pairing again, folks they'll reacquire a previously learned association faster than if they hadn't learned it before. So we can see the spontaneous recovery of dysfunctional behavior. So we've got to watch for that and 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 protect against that. Another clinical example that might resonate with this classical conditioning paradigm, I think, is drug use. So typically, needles aren't themselves very kind of appetitive. They don't elicit um, strong kind of positive reactions. But if they've been paired many times through the injection of an appetitive stimulus, so injectable drugs that are experienced as appetitive for folks, that's a strong unconditioned stimulus, the drugs. And if that's been paired repeatedly by the site of needles and other kinds of environmental stimuli, those stimuli can come to have those properties. So just seeing a needle can start to create some of the responses associated with using drugs. And so that's where we see the environment potentially being kind of problematic uh, for um, for increasing drug use. And then on the backside, with treatment, we see typically in treatment, we remove those cues. We don't have a lot of needles around. We want to help people have that success. We control the environment. But then there's a lot of awareness that as people move out of like residential treatment to outpatient, that we have to think about that natural environment because those stimuli, like needles and folks that previously folks were using drugs with, may be in the environment. And we can't use just kind of extinction procedures there because we are verbal beings. We do need to have a kind of a more robust response just than allowing kind of extinction to happen. But there's a good awareness that there could be respondent conditioning there that we need to attend to, and we need to be thoughtful about when and where we introduce those stimuli to make sure that people have the support, the behavioral support. To make the response that they want in those situations, and don't inadvertently come back under the control of unwanted stimuli and go back to unwanted responses of using drugs. All right, now we're going to pivot over and talk about operant, or sometimes called instrumental conditioning. So we're going to change our focus. Rather than looking at stimuli and then responses, we're going to shift to looking at behavior and then consequences. So again, we're looking at contingencies. So the environment creates contingencies. They create this if-then condition between the behavioral responses and the consequences of those responses. And they do that in a probabilistic way. So they're sort of statistically linked, but not maybe 100% all the time. But the environment specifies the contingency, what happens as a result of a behavior. So behavior and consequence. And we say that someone is in contact with a contingency when they're getting some of the consequences of the contingency. So when the behavior is happening and some of the consequences of the contingency are happening, we say that they are in contact with that contingency. Now we've got a new technical term here that is useful called discriminative stimuli. And we use this term to indicate when certain kinds of consequences are available. And this applies both to reinforcement and punishment. But most commonly, we talk about discriminative stimuli for reinforcement. So, meaning a stimuli that indicate when certain kinds of reinforcement are available. And of course, those things aren't intrinsic in the stimuli themselves, but they get set up based on a learning history of the stimulus predicting the consequences. So, a good example would be like traffic lights. So, um, over a period of time where you have a lot of interactions with traffic lights, you can come to learn that green lights and red lights mean different things, and different kinds of reinforcing consequences are available. So, in the presence of a green light, what reinforcing consequences are available? Well, you can most likely drive forward through the intersection and safely kind of move your car forward without getting hit. You can also avoid getting honked at by the person behind you. Um, in the presence of a red light, it's different. There, if you drive forward, you're unlikely to have reinforcing consequences. You might get hit. Um, so you come to learn that in the presence of a red light, stopping will help you keep your car safe, and you'll avoid the honks of motorists in the cross lane that are driving through. So in this case, the stimulus it tells us. Potentially that there are certain kinds of consequences available. There may be other kinds of stimuli that don't serve this function. So if you are driving and you see sort of like a "Welcome to Spokane" sign as you're driving, that doesn't necessarily indicate that any particular type of consequences are available. So it's kind of a neutral stimulus in that case. So now we are ready to introduce the classic three-term operant contingency. This is often talked about in terms of the ABC model, where we look at the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. But there's another useful set of terminology that you might want to be familiar with. So we have that discriminative stimulus serving as the antecedent. We have the response, that's our behavior. And then instead of consequence, we call it a stimulus. And that really reminds us that what's happening is the behavior is producing some kind of new stimulus. And of course, that stimulus might have a consequential function. So ABC or SDS, both ways of talking about the three-term contingency. So one example could be in the presence of a green card, person touches the green card and they receive something tangible like candy. Another example could be a parent yells. In the presence of a parent yelling, a child apologizes, and the result of that is that the parent stops yelling. One thing that's helpful to note here is how these are all kind of linked as a single unit. So, for example, a child might apologize at other times, right? If a child apologizes randomly, it may have different consequences. It may not have anything to do with a parent yelling. Um, and so over time, there may become this kind of functional link where, like, in the in the presence of the parent yelling, the child's apology really stops the yelling, and it is that stopping of the yelling that reinforces the child apologizing. But there's still that specificity where the child isn't necessarily apologizing just randomly, but it's really connected to in the presence of the parents yelling. So that's the functional three-term contingency that we look at for all kinds of behavior under operant control. And then we sometimes talk about this in terms of actually an additional term, a four-term contingency. And we talk about motivating operations. And what we mean by that is these are antecedent things. These are things that influence how well things are going to function as consequences. So, as an example, food deprivation. So, if you've already got you've been eating a bunch of candy, and then someone tries to get you to do something to receive candy, you're maybe less likely to do it because you have been eating a bunch of candy. You're not hungry. But if you've been deprived of candy for a while, the consequences of receiving candy might become much more reinforcing to you temporarily. So that food deprivation serves as a motivating operation to enhance the consequences of receiving candy. And this idea of motivating operations extends beyond just tangible things. It can get really conceptually complicated. So, for example, when we think about a locked door, suddenly really increases the meaning or the consequence, the rewardiness of finding your keys to unlock that door so that you can get back into your house or back into a car. So conceptually, there's a lot of different ways that motivating operations come into play. We'll see this later when we get back to RFT, because one sort of definition of values, verbal values, is that they're verbal motivating operations. In other words, they enhance the consequence of doing certain behaviors by enhancing kind of the symbolic value of doing those things. So values are verbal motivating operations, but typically when we think about operant behavior, we're also thinking about motivating operations in more practical senses of deprivation uh, or satiation. And then finally, there's another kind of stimulus discrimination that is useful to think about a lot. And so this is conditional discrimination. So the idea that, like, in the presence of a blue square, not every behavior is going to be reinforced. Maybe for little kids, just going around and saying what things are called or what color they are, maybe that won't get reinforced. But pretty quickly, as we get older, we don't get necessarily reinforced for that specifically. There may be a conditional stimulus that tells us what kind of reinforcing contingency we're in. So when the teacher says, for example, what shape is this, in the presence of that blue square, they need to say square to get reinforcement. And if they say blue there, they won't get reinforced. But if the question is now, what color is this, then blue is going to be reinforced and square is not. So between those things, we can start to get this 4 and 5 term conditional uh, stimulus, and we can have the motivating operations. We can have, a 4 or 5 term contingency, but all organized around this um, understanding of these antecedent stimuli, a behavior response that leads to some kind of consequence. And then that consequence is going to influence whether or not the behavior response is increased or decreased in the future. And so that's why we call it operant behavior, because it operates on the environment to produce a consequence. And that consequence itself is going to influence whether or not the behavior will be repeated in the future. So it'll move it up or move it down. Sometimes the consequence is a clear stimulus, like when you're singing a song and you produce the song in the environment. But it can also be other kinds of functional consequences, like when you sing in a dark room and the singing is functioning to reduce the consequence of that is it reduces the feeling of fear that you have. And just another quick note about consequences in general. So, as we said, consequences can include things like a stimulus being added or removed, just something changed right there. They also can change the environment in meaningful ways. So, for example, when we take the cap off a soda, it makes the soda possible to get into your mouth. So that can be reinforcing, right? So in the future, you are likely in the presence of a soda with a cap on it to remove the soda so that you can access the liquid inside. So we change the environment in ways. But at a deeper level too, Another set of consequences that might be there are those that change the contingencies going forward. So, what happens for future responses in clinical work? A good example might be when people disclose abuse. So they tell about some abuse that they've experienced. There are very different kinds of consequences that they might experience as a result of that. So, if they are believed and affirmed for sharing that, um, that may strongly and influence the behavior in the future, whether they are willing to kind of disclose, talk about abuse additionally in the future. And in other cases, the consequences of being disbelieved and unaffirmed also powerfully influence the rate of whether that disclosure of abuse happens again in the future. Now, obviously, some of this is verbally mediated. There's probably some rule following. It's not just the direct consequences shaping that. But I just wanted to highlight that, like, the consequences that people experience that influence, they may not be just in the immediate environment. They really can persist for some time, and they really could be quite different. So people could get quite different treatment as a result of a specific behavior, and that those future kind of contingencies that they face as a result of that may really influence that whether that behavior happens again. So just wanted to sensitize that it's not just in the here and now, but that I like to think of it as, in some ways, certain behaviors kind of um, unlock um, very different kind of future contingencies, and so we need to be alive to that because we may be working with a client who is strongly, like, their behavior is strongly shaped by the current environmental contingencies that they're in. They may, and it's going to be different for a client who maybe experienced being believed and affirmed for disclosing abuse versus one that was disbelieved and unaffirmed. They may have experienced very different consequences, and that may be influencing um, their current willingness to disclose about abuse. And so then we get to these definitions. So we say that consequences are reinforcing. By definition, that means that they are increasing the probability of the response happening in the presence of that antecedent in the future, and that increase is due to the consequences, not just something else. So if the behavior doesn't increase, then we can't say that it's been reinforced. Similarly, punishment, the definition is that the probability of response decreases in the presence of the antecedent condition in the future. So we have to see this decrease in the behavior, and any decrease we then can say has been punished. And so we can use kind of the noun form of, like, reinforcers and punishers when we've identified the consequences, but we have to be really careful because we can lose track of the functional relationship. And so we can sort of hope that something's a reinforcer or think that something's a reinforcer, but if it's really not having that increased rate, then it is not serving in that way. And so in a functional sense, we don't want to call it a reinforcer. Reinforcers can be primary things like food. They can also be conditioned things like tokens. So tokens aren't intrinsically maybe reinforcing, but we set up a condition where people know that those tokens can be turned in and substituted for primary reinforcers like food. And so then therefore the tokens themselves begin to have value because they're conditioned to be reinforcers. And then we can get generalized reinforcers like clickers or money. So, like, um, those things can access other kinds of reinforcers. So then we can look at the distinction between positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. This is often incorrectly used by lay people on lots of television shows. And technically, there's a little bit of debate in the field about what these mean, but essentially, that's not so important to get it exactly right. But to watch out for the actual contingencies, we usually think about positive things as things being added to the environment, and negative things being removed from the environment. So Positive reinforcement means something's added and behavior increases. Negative reinforcement means something's removed and behavior increases. Um, Positive punishment means something is added and as a result, behavior decreases. And negative punishment means something is removed and behavior decreases. So, some examples up here that you can see. So, access to screen time is a positive reinforcement. Parent stops yelling. It's reinforcing, but it's reinforcing kind of this negative, this removal of the yelling stimulus. Positive punishment means something's added. So when we have extra chores are assigned, and then negative punishment would be like something's removed, like screen time privileges are lost, and as a result, the behavior decreases, so as to not lose access to desired screen time. And then just a quick note about timeout, which is used as a behavioral intervention. This is one that sometimes can be confusing for folks, because really what the purpose of that intervention is timeout from positive reinforcement. So the kinds of things that tend to reinforce behavior because they're positive, we are going to temporarily remove a person's access to those things. So usually a child, we are removing access to kind of parent attention, to fun things in the environment temporarily. So we're temporarily going to give them a break from this positive reinforcement, so to make sure that we try not to reinforce unwanted behavior. And then after a brief time, we're going to allow them to have access to positive reinforcement. So we'll let them go back to interacting with the parent and playing with toys. And we may then continue to try to reinforce desired behaviors. But I think that that term is useful. Just remember, it is timeout from positive reinforcement. And then schedules of reinforcement. This is a huge topic. There's lots of research on this. But we want to recognize that like reinforcement doesn't just happen sort of one time. It happens in different kinds of ways. And that schedule of reinforcement is important to be aware of. So sometimes reinforcement happens naturally without us doing anything. So things can just happen in the environment that are reinforcing and we have no control over it. But a lot of times in clinical settings, we're thinking about the schedules of reinforcement that we have control over. And a couple of key things to consider with that is whether we want to make reinforcement based on some kind of ratio schedule, which is where we need like a set number of responses. So we might need somebody to do a response of a number of times before they get access to the reinforcer. Or we might want to use an interval schedule. This is where there's a specific time between responses. So you can't kind of get reinforcement until you make a response after the minimum time has passed. We also want to think about whether the schedule is going to be based on a fixed number or fixed interval or a variable interval. So whether the specific number or a variable number of responses or a fixed time or a variable amount of time has passed. And we'll get different kind of strength of the pattern based on the schedules that we use. We want to think about if we want to use extinction. Extinction here means that we are going to withhold the previously established reinforcement. So if people are typically working to get a particular kind of consequence, whether that's desired or undesired, extinction means we're gonna break that. We're no longer going to deliver that consequence. When we're using this clinically, we typically don't use extinction alone. We also want to usually pair it with a reinforcement schedule where we are reinforcing an alternative response, because we can see extinction bursts and we can see aggressive behavior. Putting things on just pure extinction sometimes doesn't work very well. So we want to be reinforcing the alternative response. We know that reinforcement or punishment is very sensitive to timing, and the most effective consequence is when there's a minimal delay between the response and the consequence. So if consequences are really delayed, they tend to lose their potency. So we want to be thinking about this as folks that deliver consequences or setting up consequences for our clients. That's why we might want to use something like a condition reinforcer, like a token. That token system can help reinforce, because we can immediately give the token, and then if the person has knows that the token is meaningful, it can be helpful if we're not able to get them access to the primary reinforcer right away. And so this brings us back to that original topic we had about the difference between function and topography. So when we're talking about operants, the operant response classes are going to be defined by their functions, not necessarily by the specific form or topography. So anything that sort of has the same contingency, the same like response leads to the same outcome, are going to be considered part of the same operant class. So in other words, what behavior does functionally is more important than what it looks like. And so we're always organizing these operants around the functions that they do. Some of them tend to be a little bit kind of topographic in nature. So like the door, like that example of like opening doors in different ways. There are different ways to do that, but they all kind of have that same kind of topographic look where like the door opens. So sometimes we talk about them a bit topographically, but then there are some kinds of operant behaviors that really don't have any particular kinds of topographies. So we would call them like generalized operants, purely functional operants, overarching operants, to really emphasize that there really isn't anything useful about the topography that we can point to. So a good example would be imitation behavior. So we know what it means when we say, imitate me, but we can't really specify what kind of topographies that's going to look like, right? Because the person being copied, they could sit still for 30 seconds, they could move around, up and down, they could make certain sounds. There's a lot of different topographies they could have, and what we'd be looking at is basically how well uh, the subject is having this point to point correspondence with what the person's doing in that moment, but we have no idea what it's going to look like at any moment. So there's no way to kind of define imitation except by looking at like, is the subject doing what what the teacher is doing in that moment. That is what we mean by imitation, and that's what we would reinforce if we were teaching somebody to learn to imitate somebody. So that's an example of a generalized operant. And this definition of an operant does kind of matter in a technical sense. In ABA world, they are still kind of having this fight about whether RFT is an operant. So that's kind of Steve Hayes's claim, is that RFT, or relational framing, relating, is an example of a generalized operant. And then we can apply sort of all of our knowledge of generalized operants to understand and work with the verbal behavior that we see as part of RFT. So not everybody in ABA world agrees with that, but in sort of CBS world, we take that view, and we see RFT as an operant. And some of the reason why we think that is that when we look at operant behavior, there's some key definitions that we would look for, reviewed here in this paper, about the past 35 years of RFT research. But operant behavior gets acquired and strengthened over time, and it happens through a history of reinforcement or multiple exemplar training. So I'm thinking about that example of like teaching someone to imitate, right? That imitation response gets acquired and strengthened over multiple examples, where there's training trials, and then the specific kind of reinforcement that teaches people what we mean by that operant class, what they need to do to get reinforcement for imitation. Operants should also show flexibility or changes in responses to changes in the environment. So they should be sensitive to changes in the environment. Um, we should be able to show that we can influence them by antecedents, what we do kind of prior to the behavioral response, and also that they should be sensitive to consequential stimulus control. So what we do afterwards to increase or decrease the rate of responding should show those patterns. So all of those pieces together, what we would look for to say something is an operant. And the claim is that relational framing is an example of the kind of generalized operant that we can see, and therefore we can use all of the principles of operant conditioning to try to train and establish these relational frames, and then we'll turn to what happens once these relational frames um, are acquired, because they then come back and sort of change the way that we interact with the world based on these more basic direct contingency learnings, the classical and operant conditionings that we've talked about here. So operant conditioning, important for RFT, more to come once RFT comes onto the scene.